0800 hours, September 19th, 1944. The fog lifting off the fields near Arracourt, France, is a death sentence. Inside the turret of Cobra, an M4 Sherman of the 37th Tank Battalion, the crew sees the nightmare scenario. 800 yards, dead ahead. The sloped frontal armor of a German Mark V Panther. The German is stationary. He is hull down. His 75mm KWK-42 cannon is already loaded. He has the perfect ambush. Standard American doctrine is absolute. Stop the tank. Wait for the suspension to settle. Aim. Fire. But Sergeant Rossi knows the math. Stopping the tank to stabilize the gun takes 5 seconds. The Panther needs 2 seconds to kill him. So Rossi screams the order that defies every page of the training manual. Driver. Full throttle. Do not stop. The 30-ton Sherman surges forward, slamming into the ruts, bouncing violently at 15 miles per hour. By all laws of physics, the gunner shouldn't be able to hit the broadside of a barn. But inside the turret, the 75mm gun isn't bouncing. It's floating, eerily motionless, perfectly level. To understand why this tank didn't miss, we have to look inside a secret mechanism that most American crews were using as a footrest. That footrest was the unloved, misunderstood answer to a brutal tactical equation that had been killing American crews since the hedgerows of Normandy. To understand the miracle at Arracourt, you first have to understand the physics of the short halt, a doctrine that transformed the M4 Sherman from a mobile weapon into a stationary coffin. In 1944, tank warfare was governed by a cruel paradox. A tank is designed to move, but to kill, it had to stop. Consider the mechanics of the M4 Sherman. It rode on a vertical volute spring suspension system, the VVSS. It was reliable, rugged, and easy to repair, but it was also bouncy. When a 33-ton steel beast, moving at 15 miles per hour, suddenly slammed on the brakes, the laws of inertia took over. The tracks locked, digging into the earth. But the massive hull wanted to keep going. The nose would dive violently toward the dirt, compressing the front springs before rebounding upward toward the sky. For the driver, this was just a rough ride. For the gunner, looking through the narrow soda straw view of his M70 telescopic sight, it was a catastrophe. Imagine trying to thread a needle while riding a roller coaster. As the tank shuddered to a halt, the gunner's world became a nauseating blur of vertical oscillation. The glowing reticle in his sight didn't just vibrate, it swung wildly. 1 second, he was looking at the clouds. The next, he was staring at the mud, 3 feet in front of the tracks. Sky, dirt, sky, dirt. This was the dampening period. The crew had to wait for the kinetic energy to bleed off, for the springs to settle, and for the gun to stop bobbing. In dry testing grounds back in the States, this took about 3 seconds. In the soft, sodden fields of France, with a heavy combat load, it could take up to 5 seconds. In a modern context, that is a heartbeat. In a tank duel, it is an eternity. While the American gunner was fighting his own suspension, wrestling with the hand wheels to get the reticle back on target, his enemy was already at work. The German Panther sitting across the field didn't have to stop. It was already stopped. It was waiting in a defensive ambush position, hull down, meaning only its thick, sloped turret was visible above the ridge. The German gunner, peering through his superior Zeiss optics, didn't have to deal with oscillation. His sight picture was static. His heart rate was the only variable. He had already ranged the ground. He had already lead the target. The math was inescapable. Second one, the Sherman driver sees the Panther and slams the brakes. The tank pitches forward. Second two, the Sherman is rocking. The German gunner makes a final micro-adjustment. Second three, the Sherman is still settling. The German fires. Second four, the high-velocity 75mm KWK-42 shell screams across the gap at 3,000 feet per second. It tears through the Sherman's frontal armor before the American gunner has even seen a stable image of the enemy. This was the mathematics of a coffin. The very act of stopping to aim gave the enemy a fatal time advantage. Yet, the alternative was considered impossible. If the Sherman kept moving, that oscillation didn't stop, it became continuous. Driving over plowed fields or shell craters caused the tank to pitch and roll unpredictably. Without stopping, the gun barrel acted like a giant pointer following the hull's movement. If the tank drove over a rock, The hull tilted up, and the gun pointed at the moon. If it hit a rut, the gun pointed at the grass. To fire on the move was to waste ammunition. A shell fired from a moving tank was more likely to hit a bird or a mole than a panzer. So, the crews followed their training. They saw the enemy. They stopped. They died. The frustration in the armored divisions was palpable. They were riding in machines capable of 25 miles per hour cross-country, yet combat turned them into sitting ducks. The men on the front lines, the dog faces and tankers, believed this was just the reality of war, that technology hadn't caught up to the need for speed. They believed they were fighting with inferior equipment, doomed to trade 3 or 4 Shermans for every one Panther, simply to overwhelm the Germans with numbers. But they were wrong. The technology did exist. The tragedy of the early encounters in France wasn't that the Sherman lacked the ability to fire on the move. It was that the solution was sitting right there, inside the turret, bolted to the floor of the fighting compartment. It was a black metal box, humming with electricity, connected to a complex system of hydraulic pumps and reservoirs. The Ordnance Department called it the Westinghouse One-Axis Gyroscopic Stabilizer. It was a piece of engineering brilliance, light years ahead of anything the Germans possessed. It was designed to solve the exact problem of vertical oscillation, but there was a massive disconnect between the engineers in Detroit and the muddy, exhausted teenagers fighting in Lorraine. The engineers saw a breakthrough. The crews saw a fragile, confusing, buzzing nuisance that leaked fluid and drifted out of calibration. To the average soldier, the stabilizer was science fiction that didn't work in the real world. It was a delicate instrument in a sledgehammer war. So, they did what soldiers always do with equipment they don't trust or understand. They turned it off. They disconnected the master switch. They used the gyro housing as a step to climb out of the turret. They bled the hydraulic fluid and forgot about it. They chose the certainty of the short halt and the coffin that came with it over the uncertainty of a machine they hadn't been properly trained to master. But in the 37th Tank Battalion, under the command of a relentless Lieutenant Colonel named Creighton Abrams, the footrest was about to become the deadliest weapon on the Western Front. Abrams didn't care about rumors or comfort. He cared about killing Panthers. And he knew that the only way to survive the mathematics of the coffin was to change the equation entirely. Changing that equation didn't require a new tank, a bigger gun, or thicker armor. It required the men of the 37th Tank Battalion to unlock the potential of a small, greasy black box that sat unobtrusively on the floor of their turrets, humming like an angry hornet. This was the Westinghouse One-Axis Gyroscopic Stabilizer, and in the fall of 1944, it was arguably the most sophisticated piece of technology on the European battlefield. To understand why it was a game changer and why it was almost universally despised, you have to look past the heavy steel of the tank and into the delicate, golden age electronics inside that box. The principle was deceptive in its simplicity, grounded in the physics of a child's spinning top but applied to 30 tons of violence. At the heart of the system was a small gyroscope, an electrically driven wheel spinning at nearly 14,000 revolutions per minute. A gyroscope, once spinning, fights to stay upright. It resists any force that tries to tilt it. Westinghouse engineers harnessed this resistance to create a brain for the Sherman's main gun. The stabilizer didn't steer the turret left or right. That was still the gunner's job, but it ruthlessly controlled the vertical elevation, the exact axis where the Sherman suspension caused the most chaos. Here is how it worked in the split-second violence of combat. As the Sherman hit a deep rut, the hull would pitch forward, diving toward the mud. A standard gun barrel would dive with it, sending the shell harmlessly into the dirt, but inside the Westinghouse box, the gyroscope refused to move. As the tank hull tilted, the gyro stayed level, and this difference in angle closed a pair of hair-thin silver contacts. Click. Instantly, an electrical signal fired to a magnetic valve on the oil gear pump. Whoosh! High-pressure hydraulic fluid surged into the elevation cylinder, attached to the massive breech of the 75mm gun. The hydraulics pushed the breech upward with tremendous force, counteracting the tank's downward dive. The result was an optical illusion that defied belief. The tank pitched and bucked violently beneath the crew, but the gun barrel remained locked on the horizon, floating with the supernatural stillness of a pointing finger. The Germans had nothing like this. The Russians had nothing like this. The Panther and the Tiger were masterpieces of mechanical engineering, thick steel, high-velocity guns, overlapping road wheels, but they were dumb giants. They relied on sheer mass to dampen vibration. The Sherman relied on active, aggressive feedback loops. It was the difference between a sledgehammer and a scalpel. However, a scalpel is useless if the surgeon doesn't know how to hold it. And this brings us to the secret in the grease, the fatal flaw that turned this technological marvel into a hated piece of junk for the average crew. The Westinghouse system was not soldier-proof. It was a high-strung, temperamental instrument that demanded perfect maintenance in conditions that were defined by imperfection. It ran on hydraulic fluid that had to be absolutely pure. A single bubble of air trapped in the lines, a common occurrence when bouncing across a battlefield, would turn the crisp, hydraulic snap of the gun into a spongy, lagging mess. Gunners called it the drift. If the system wasn't calibrated to within a millimeter, the gun wouldn't just stay level, it would slowly creep upward or downward on its own, fighting the gunner's control. Imagine trying to aim at a Panther 800 yards away, while a ghost invisible to you is slowly pulling your gun barrel toward the sky. To fix it, the crew had to perform a ritual known as bleeding the lines. It involved cracking open high-pressure valves, getting covered in slick, stinking hydraulic oil, and carefully purging every microscopic pocket of air while the tank was cold. It was messy, frustrating, and time-consuming work. And for what? Most crews had never been properly trained on how to use it. The training manuals back in the States were dense, technical, and written by engineers who had never sat in a freezing turret in the middle of a muddy winter. Instructors, pressed for time to get fresh meat to the front, often skipped the chapter on stabilization entirely. "Just turn it off," they'd say. "It drains the battery. It fills the turret with fumes. It's just a gadget." So, the secret in the grease became a self-fulfilling prophecy of failure. Because the crews didn't maintain it, it didn't work. Because it didn't work, they disconnected it. The master switches were flipped to off. The delicate gyro housings became step stools for muddy boots. The hydraulic lines were bypassed. By September 1944, ordnance surveys estimated that nearly 90% of Sherman crews in the European theater had disabled their stabilizers. They had voluntarily surrendered their only technological advantage over the Germans because it was too much hassle. They chose to fight the Panther on its own terms, stationary, heavy, and lethal, rather than mastering the one tool that could let them dance around the giant. But in the 37th Tank Battalion, hassle was not an excuse, it was a challenge. And for the gunners under Abrams, the grease and the grime were about to become the holy oil of a new religion. They were about to find out that the broken box on the floor was actually the key to a massacre. That massacre, however, remained a theoretical possibility because the men inside the tanks were fighting a war of survival, not a war of engineering optimization. To the average 19-year-old loader from Kansas or the 20-year-old driver from Brooklyn, the Westinghouse box represented something dangerous: complexity. In the chaotic hierarchy of the U.S. Army, simplicity was God. A hammer is simple. A standard 75mm shell is simple, but a gyroscopic firing circuit that requires bleeding hydraulic lines of microscopic air bubbles every 48 hours? That was a liability. The rejection of the stabilizer wasn't just laziness, it was cultural. The American GI of 1944 was a citizen soldier, often hastily trained and thrust into a machine he barely understood. When a piece of equipment acted up when the gun barrel started, hunting, bobbing up and down rhythmically like a ghost was tugging on the breech, the instinct wasn't to consult the technical manual. The instinct was to kill the ghost. Rumors spread through the barracks like trench foot. "The gyro drains the battery dead in 10 minutes, one sergeant would claim. "The hydraulic fluid releases toxic fumes that blind you," another would swear. "It throws off the turret balance and strips the gears." None of these things were true. The stabilizer ran on a separate electrical circuit. The fluid was standard hydraulic oil, and the gears were more than strong enough. But the rumors gave the crews a valid excuse to reach down, flip the master toggle to off, and go back to the short halt method they understood. By the time the 4th Armored Division reached the Moselle River in September, the stabilizer rebellion was nearly total. In almost every tank battalion across France, the gyroscope was dead weight. In almost every battalion, except the 37th. The 37th Tank Battalion was different because its commander, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, was different. Abrams was not a man who believed in the impossible. He believed in the application of violence through speed. He looked at the Sherman tank and saw something other commanders missed. They saw a thin-skinned medium tank that needed to hide. Abrams saw a hot rod with a cannon. He understood the physics of the battlefield intuitively. If you stop, the Germans win. Their guns are bigger, their armor is thicker, and their sights are better. In a static slugging match, the Sherman loses every time. Therefore, the Sherman must never be static. But Abrams also knew that moving without shooting was just a fancy way of dying. He needed his tanks to be predators, not targets. When he discovered that his crews were disabling the very device that made this predatory movement possible, he didn't issue a memo. He issued an ultimatum. The maintenance of the Westinghouse stabilizer became a command priority equivalent to keeping the engine running or the gun loaded. The scene in the 37th's Lager areas at night shifted from rest to relentless, greasy labor. While other battalions slept, Abrams' gunners and maintenance crews were waist-deep in the turrets, flashlights in their mouths, wrestling with the oil gear pumps. They had to learn to feel the hydraulics. They learned that the system was alive. If the gun was sluggish, the fluid was too cold. Run the heater. If the gun was jittery, there was air in the line. Bleed the valve until the fluid ran clear red without a single bubble. If the gyro drifted, the tension spring was loose. Tighten it by a quarter turn. It was tedious, miserable work. The men cursed the Westinghouse engineers. They cursed the hydraulic fluid that stained their hands permanently black. They cursed Abrams. But then came the drills. Abrams didn't just want the equipment to work. He wanted the men to trust it. He ordered live-fire exercises that terrified the new replacements. He made them drive their Shermans at full throttle over broken terrain ditches, berms, shell holes, while the gunner kept his eyes glued to the telescopic sight. At first, it was a disaster. Gunners threw up from the motion sickness. Drivers smashed their heads against the periscopes. But slowly, the muscle memory of the gyroscope began to take over. The gunners realized that they didn't have to fight the gun. They had to let it go. They had to relax their grip on the elevation handwheel and let the buzzing black box do the heavy lifting. They watched in awe as the world outside pitched violently sky, ground, while the crosshairs in their sight remained locked on the target like they were painted there. They learned to drive into the gun. Instead of shouting, "Stop!" when a target appeared, the gunner learned to shout, "Steady!" The driver would smooth out the ride, not by braking, but by maintaining momentum, allowing the suspension and the stabilizer to work in harmony. By mid-September 1944, the 37th Tank Battalion had ceased to be a collection of citizen soldiers trying to survive. They had become a unit of virtuosos, playing instruments that no one else knew how to use. They were tired, they were dirty, and they were sick of hydraulic fluid. But they were ready, and they had to be. Because on the morning of September 19th, near the village of Arracourt, the fog was about to lift, and the 5th Panzer Army was waiting. The lazy American crews were about to pay for their rumors in blood, but the men of the 37th were about to cash in their hard work for the ultimate prize, a fair fight against a superior enemy. The test of the broken box had arrived. The test came at 0800 hours, not with a bang, but with a sudden, terrifying clarity. The thick morning mist that had blanketed the fields of Lorraine evaporated, revealing the rolling farmland south of Arracourt like a curtain being ripped from a stage. On one side of the valley sat the vanguard of General Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army, over 200 armored vehicles, spearheaded by the feared Mark V Panthers. On the other, the exposed flank of Lieutenant Colonel Abrams' 37th Tank Battalion. For the German commanders, the situation was perfect. They had superior range, superior armor, and the initiative. They saw the American Shermans moving in the open, silhouetted against the tree lines. The German radios crackled with succinct, confident orders. Halt, target, fire. The Panthers ground to a halt. Their massive tracks bit into the soil, their suspensions settled, and their long 75mm barrels began to traverse. They were playing by the rules of engagement that had worked since 1939. Stop to shoot, shoot to kill. But inside the turret of Sergeant Rossi's Sherman, the rules had changed. As the fog cleared and the gray shapes of the Panthers materialized at 800 yards, Rossi didn't call for a halt. He didn't order his driver to reverse into cover. He saw the Panthers stopping, saw them transforming from moving threats into stationary targets, and he recognized the fatal pause. "Driver, step on it, close the distance." The Sherman engine roared, kicking up clods of damp earth as the tank surged forward. To the German gunners watching through their sights, this must have looked like suicide. A Sherman charging a Panther head-on was madness. It was a Ronson begging to be lit, but as the distance closed to 700 yards, then 600, something inexplicable happened. The Sherman didn't stop to fire. It kept coming, weaving slightly to throw off the German aim, bouncing over the furrowed ground at 15 miles per hour. Inside the hull, the violence was absolute. The suspension groaned under the impacts, throwing the loader against the ammo rack. The driver wrestled with the steering levers, fighting to keep the tank from throwing a track. But inside the gunner's sight, there was a supernatural calm. The world outside was a chaotic blur of green and brown, pitching up and down like a ship in a storm. Yet, the glowing red triangle of the reticle remained fixed in space, hovering over the frontal armor of the lead Panther. The Westinghouse gyroscope was screaming at 14,000 revolutions per minute, sensing every dip and rise of the hull, firing rapid-fire hydraulic pulses to the gun breech. Dip, pulse, elevate, rise, pulse, depress. The gunner didn't fight the controls. He trusted the hum. He let the box do the work. At 500 yards, the German gunner was finally ready. He had settled his suspension, calculated the lead for the moving target, and was exhaling to squeeze the trigger. He was 2 seconds too late. Fire. The Sherman's 75mm gun erupted while the tank was mid-lurch, both tracks off the ground. The shell screamed across the gap. Because the Sherman was moving, the German gunner's calculated aim point was now empty air. But the American shell, guided by the broken gyro, slammed into the Panther's turret ring. The impact was catastrophic. The German tank shuddered, smoke pouring from the hatch. Before the German platoon could process the impossibility of what they had just seen, it happened again. Another Sherman from the 37th, moving at full speed on the flank, fired on the move. Another hit. The battlefield devolved into a frantic, close-range brawl that favored the predator, not the giant. The Panthers, built for long-range dominance, were sluggish. Their turrets rotated slowly. To track the speeding Shermans, the German drivers had to traverse the entire tank, a maneuver that required them to stop and pivot. Every time a Panther stopped to align its gun, it died. The Americans were swarming them, using the stabilizer to fire high-explosive rounds into the German tracks to immobilize them, then closing to point-blank range to put armor-piercing rounds through the thinner side armor. It was a dance of death, and the Shermans were leading. Abrams' voice cut through the radio net, calm and relentless. "Attack! Attack! Don't let them set!" The German formation began to crumble. They were psychologically unprepared for a frantic, mobile enemy that refused to stand still and die. The inferior American tanks were circling them, hitting them on the move with impossible accuracy. By noon, the fields around Arracourt were littered with burning German armor. The invincible Panthers lay smoking, their turrets blown off, their tracks shattered. The 37th Tank Battalion hadn't just survived, they had rampaged. And as the crews climbed out of their steaming tanks, wiping the black hydraulic grease from their faces, they looked at the little black boxes on the turret floors with a new expression. It wasn't hatred anymore, it was reverence. The useless gadget had just saved their lives. That black box didn't just save them, it transformed them from prey into the most efficient killers on the Western Front. As the smoke cleared on that first morning, the men of the 37th Tank Battalion realized they had stumbled onto a tactical revolution. They had broken the paralysis of the short halt. And in doing so, they had unlocked a level of violence that the German command structure simply could not process. The engagement at Arracourt didn't end at noon. It raged for 11 days, becoming the largest tank-on-tank battle of the U.S. Army's campaign in Europe. And for 11 days, the inferior Shermans dismantled the elite armor of the Third Reich with the surgical precision of a butcher who knows exactly where to cut. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, was a master of mobile warfare. He had thrown 2 full Panzer brigades, fresh units, equipped with factory-new Panthers into the fight, expecting to crush the American flank. By all conventional military logic, his heavy armor should have swept the field. His tanks had better guns, better sights, and thicker steel. But Manteuffel was fighting a ghost. Every time his Panthers established a defensive line, waiting for the Americans to stop and engage in a traditional gunnery duel, the Americans refused to cooperate. They appeared out of the fog and the tree lines, moving at speeds that made German range-finding impossible. A Panther gunner, trying to track a Sherman moving at 15 miles per hour at close range, found his heavy turret traversing too slowly to keep up. By the time he lined up the shot, the Sherman was already flanking him, its 75mm gun stabilized and firing with a rhythmic, hammering cadence that seemed impossible for a moving vehicle. The reports filtering back to the German headquarters were filled with confusion and borderline panic. Field commanders reported that the Americans were using a new type of tank, one that could glide over rough terrain without losing its aim. They reported taking fire from Shermans that were effectively airborne as they crested ridges. They reported being hit in the weak side armor before they could even rotate their hulls to face the threat. The casualty count was staggering. By the time the German offensive collapsed on September 29th, the fields of Lorraine were a graveyard of twisted Teutonic steel. The 5th Panzer Army had lost 86 Panthers and over 100 other armored vehicles. The cost to the 4th Armored Division? 32 Shermans. It was a kill ratio of nearly 7-to-1 in favor of the Ronson. It was a statistical anomaly that defied every pre-war war game and every post-war myth about the superiority of German engineering. And the Germans were desperate to understand how they had been beaten so badly by a tank they considered a toy. The answer came in the interrogation tents behind the American lines. A captured German major, a battalion commander who had lost his entire unit in 48 hours, sat across from an American intelligence officer. He was exhausted, covered in soot, and visibly shaken. He didn't ask for water or cigarettes. He asked a technical question. "Let me see the automatic loader," he demanded. The American officer was confused. "We don't have automatic loaders. The loader is a kid named Smith." The German shook his head, refusing to believe it. "Do not lie to me. No human loader can serve the gun that fast while moving cross-country. No gunner can hit a target at 600 meters while driving over a plowed field. You have a gyroscopic gun mount or an automatic loading mechanism. I want to see it." He was half right. It wasn't an autoloader. It was just a kid named Smith slamming shells into the breech, bruised and battered by the ride. But it was a gyroscopic gun mount. The German officer was describing the Westinghouse stabilizer, the very device American troops had spent months calling junk. The irony was absolute. The enemy, the masters of tank warfare, had correctly identified the decisive technological advantage of the battle, while the American army was still debating whether the device was worth the battery power. The victory at Arracourt proved Abrams' doctrine beyond a shadow of a doubt. The stabilizer wasn't a luxury, it was the equalizer. It allowed a 30-ton tank with a mediocre gun to outfight a 45-ton tank with a great gun, simply by negating the friction of terrain. It turned the Sherman into a stable firing platform that could dictate the tempo of the engagement. But vindication on the battlefield doesn't always translate to vindication in the history books. While the 37th Tank Battalion knew the truth that the greasy black box was the reason they were still alive, the lesson didn't travel up the chain of command as clearly as it should have. The Army looked at the victory and saw superior American tactics and air support, missing the granular, mechanical reality of what happened when a gunner trusted his gyroscope. The slaughter in the fog was the high water mark of American armored innovation in World War II. It was the moment the Sherman ceased to be a compromise and became a weapon of dominance. But as the war ground on into Germany, and as the veterans of Arracourt rotated home or became casualties, the secret of the stabilizer began to fade. The maintenance grew tedious again. The new replacements arrived without training. The switches were flipped back to off. The U.S. Army had possessed the first true main battle tank capability in history, fire-on-the-move accuracy, and then, in a fit of collective amnesia, they forgot how to use it. It would take decades, and another war, for the lesson to be learned again. But for those 11 days in September 1944, the gyroscope didn't just work, it sang. That mechanical song did not echo into the future. It was drowned out by the noise of a different narrative, one that painted the M4 Sherman as a failure of American industrial hubris. For 80 years, popular history has remembered the Sherman as the Ronson, the Tommy Cooker, a thin-skinned sacrificial lamb thrown into the meat grinder against the superior German cats. We are told it won the war solely through the brute force of mass production, that we simply built more targets than the Germans had bullets. But the slaughter at Arracourt proves that this death trap mythology is incomplete. When you strip away the post-war cynicism and look at the engineering DNA, the M4 Sherman equipped with the Westinghouse stabilizer was not a failure. It was the grandfather of the modern main battle tank. Consider the definition of a main battle tank, or MBT. It is a vehicle that balances firepower, armor, and mobility to dominate the battlefield. But mobility in the modern sense doesn't just mean driving fast. It means fighting fast. It means the ability to traverse cross-country while delivering lethal, accurate fire. Today, the M1 Abrams is the apex predator of land warfare, precisely because it can thunder across the desert at 40 miles per hour and put a sabot round through a window frame 2 miles away. The M1 Abrams achieves this with digital ballistic computers, laser rangefinders, and thermal optics. But the concept, the fundamental tactical doctrine of aggressive, stabilized fire was born in the grease-stained turrets of the 37th Tank Battalion. The Westinghouse one-axis gyroscopic stabilizer was the analog ancestor of the digital systems protecting American crews today. It was the first time an army attempted to decouple the gun from the chaos of the terrain. The Germans, for all their engineering prowess with the Tiger and Panther, were building the ultimate expression of the previous war. They were building mobile pillboxes, heavy, slow, and reliant on static ambushes. They were perfecting the past. The Sherman, with its flawed armor and underpowered gun, was accidentally inventing the future. However, being ahead of your time is often indistinguishable from being wrong. The tragedy of the stabilizer is not that it didn't work, but that the institution of the U.S. Army failed to internalize why it worked. When the victory parades ended in 1945, the lessons of Arracourt were filed away in dusty archives, ignored in favor of a new obsession: heavy armor. The Army looked at the Panther and decided it wanted one of its own. They developed the M26 Pershing and later the M46 Patton, tanks that prioritized thick steel and big guns over the fluid agility of the Sherman. While these new tanks retained stabilization systems on paper, the culture of maintenance mastery that Creighton Abrams had instilled in his men evaporated. The peacetime Army returned to its old habits. Training budgets were cut. The complex, finicky hydraulic systems were once again viewed as a nuisance. By the time the Korean War broke out in 1950, American tankers were once again fighting in mountainous, rough terrain where stabilization should have been the deciding factor against the Soviet-built T-34 seconds. But combat reports from Korea tell a depressing story. Crews had forgotten the dance of Arracourt. They disconnected the stabilizers. They stopped to shoot. They reverted to the short halt. They unlearned the lesson. The Army had possessed a capability that no other nation on earth had, a capability that terrified German commanders, and they let it rot because it was too hard to maintain. It would take another 30 years, and the development of the M60A1 and eventually the M1 Abrams for the U.S. Army to fully re-embrace the doctrine of fire on the move. This brings us to the uncomfortable truth about military innovation and why stories like the mirror myth are so seductive. We want to believe that innovation is a lightning bolt, a sudden flash of genius where a soldier grabs a shaving mirror and saves the day. It's a romantic idea because it requires no systemic change. It's cheap, it's easy. But the reality of the Westinghouse stabilizer is the opposite. Innovation is a grind. It is dirty, unglamorous work. It is the refusal to accept good enough. It is a lieutenant colonel screaming at his men to bleed hydraulic lines at 3 a.m. in the freezing rain. It is the discipline to master a complex machine until you can trust it with your life. The Sherman wasn't a death trap. In the hands of the lazy or the untrained, it was a coffin. But in the hands of the 37th Tank Battalion, it was a glimpse of the 21st century. The death trap myth is a comforting lie. We tell ourselves to excuse the fact that we sent men into battle without teaching them how to use their own weapons. The stabilizer didn't fail the soldiers. The system failed the stabilizer. And as we look back at the fields of Lorraine, we have to ask ourselves, how many other broken technologies are sitting on the floor of our vehicles right now, dismissed as junk, simply because we haven't done the work to understand them? That question haunts every military historian, because the difference between a useless gadget and a war-winning weapon is rarely the device itself. It is the terrifying act of trust required to use it. When we look back at the 37th Tank Battalion, we have to realize that the true bravery displayed at Arracourt wasn't just the physical courage to charge a Panther. It was the intellectual courage to disobey the survival instinct. Every neuron in a tanker's brain has evolved to scream one command when danger appears: stop, freeze, focus. To override that screaming instinct, to slam the throttle forward and surrender your life to the invisible mathematics of a spinning gyroscope is a specific kind of terror that metals don't capture. This is why the mirror myth is so seductive. and ultimately, so dangerous. Stories about soldiers using bathroom mirrors to trick the enemy are comforting. They tell us that American victory came from scrappy, improvised luck, that we can MacGyver our way out of anything with duct tape and a smile. It suggests that training and technology don't matter as long as you have gumption. But the story of the Westinghouse stabilizer teaches the harder, colder truth. The Sherman crews didn't survive because they got lucky with a shaving mirror. They survived because they did the work. They survived because they spent sleepless nights bleeding air bubbles out of hydraulic lines. They survived because they mastered a complex, frustrating, high-tech system that everyone else was too lazy to understand. Arracourt proved that the M4 Sherman was not the Ronson. It was a weapon system that was only as good as the men inside it. In the hands of the untrained, it was a target. In the hands of the 37th, it was a predator that broke the Wehrmacht's back. However, the lesson of the forgotten tech didn't end in the mud of Lorraine. As the Army moved into the Cold War, they built new tanks like the M46 Patton, heavier and stronger, yet they allowed the doctrine of stabilization to wither, forcing a new generation to relearn these bloody lessons in Korea. Innovation is fragile. It is not a permanent state. It is a daily discipline. The most dangerous dead zone isn't the space in front of a tank. It is the gap between the technology we have and the willingness to master it. The Sherman wasn't the only Allied machine that history has misunderstood or simplified. While the 37th was revolutionizing ground warfare, high in the skies above them, another legend was struggling to be born. We know the P-51 Mustang as the Cadillac of the sky, the flawless fighter that saved the bomber offensive. But the truth is, the early Mustang was a disaster, a heavy, sluggish brick that pilots hated. It didn't become a legend because of American industrial might. It became a legend because a forgotten Polish engineer, working in a drafty British hangar, realized that everyone else was looking at the aerodynamics upside down. He proposed a modification so radical that the engineers at North American Aviation said it would crash the plane. He did it anyway. If you want to understand how a single piece of bad math almost lost us the air war and how one man's rebellion fixed it, make sure you are subscribed. We will be declassifying that file in our next briefing. If this deep dive into the Westinghouse stabilizer changed how you see the Sherman tank, hit the like button. It helps us fight the algorithm and keep these histories alive. Tell us in the comments, what other piece of junk equipment from World War II do you think was actually a misunderstood masterpiece? Dismissed.